Offended.
No attempt.
I think so.
Hello, everyone. Good turnout. I really appreciate it. For those that don't know me, my name is Brian Addison. I'm a co-founder and editor with Longbeachize, which is now proudly a sister publication of the Long Beach Post, of which I serve as an editor and columnist for as well. I promise I will make this quick, but I just wanted to give a special thank to our sponsors, the Long Beach Community Foundation through the Knight Foundation, Imprint Culture Lab, a subsidiary of Intertrend Communications, Pacros and De Los Reyes Lawyers, City Fabric, the Streets Blog family, Hotel Maya, and our hosts, Studio 111. Before I hand it off to Alan and Francis, I just want to briefly tell you how this series came about. For those who follow me, they know I have a pretty extensive social media following. I've been writing about this city for over a decade, and what I discovered as I was trying to present people with evidence for certain things is that despite being nonprofit, academically sound, nonpartisan research, if it didn't fit their world purview, they would reject it. And as my personal opinions became more public, I was put into this box where it became increasingly difficult for me to engage in fruitful conversations about things. So my idea was to escape the digital divide, get people away from their keyboards, from behind their screens, and have face-to-face conversations with folks who aren't from Long Beach. So you might know of them, but you most likely don't know them personally. And I really hope that this will hopefully engage in fruitful dialogue. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Alan Pullman from Studio 111. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Wow, it's really great to see all you here. We set up this space for just this kind of use, and it's fantastic to see it being used the way we want to. If there are some people in the back that want to have a seat, there are a bunch of seats in the front. You don't have to sit through our whole droning discussion. You can leave early. We won't be offended. We probably won't even notice. So come up if you want to find a seat. I am Alan Pullman. I'm a senior principal here at Studio 11 and RDC, and along with Michael Bond. Michael, raise your hand. The other senior principal here at RDC and Studio 111. And Mitra Esfandiari. Great to see you, Mitra. We're really proud, and we were really excited when Brian approached us about hosting a talk, one of his emphasized talks, and he wanted it to be on urban design and design in general. We thought, well, that would be great. We'd love to do that. Took us a little while to figure out what it would be, but we were so excited when we convinced Francis to come all the way down from Santa Monica to have a talk with us. I see Alan Loomis from Santa Monica, so you're not alone. You guys should have carpooled.
We should.
Just really great. I mean, how many people have listened to Francis's show and heard about DNA and KCRW? Everyone. And you know, it's the most remarkable show because it really is one of the only kind of like avenues that you can listen and hear about design and culture and how they intersect in Los Angeles. So it's a great resource, and we are really honored that you came down today to be with us. And also on this panel here is Scott Parker. Scott is design director at C111, and if you like some of the projects we've done, Scott has definitely had a hand in it. Or what?
Or not.
Or no, he has. He's an amazing architect. He's also a great drummer, and he makes a really good rum drink. And so
it's true.
And he could talk about that probably more passionately than architecture, but it's really interesting. Anyway, so I just wanted to introduce you guys. We're gonna Francis is gonna start with a little discussion point. We're gonna talk a little bit for 40 minutes or so, and then we want to really try to have a dialogue with you all. Because I think, who's here because they're interested in cities or design or urbanism? Yeah, they all want to talk about this kind of stuff. So that's great. But right now, I'm going to hand it over to Francis.
Well, Alan, thank you so much. I would love to know why people would be here if they weren't interested in architecture and urbanism. The food.
There is free food.
And your great office, which is so impressive. Anyway, thank you all for welcoming us here, us from Santa Monica. It's a great expedition. My colleague Avishai Artsy, who is DNA's producer, is here too. So we're both really intrigued to find out more about what's going on here and to talk to all of you. So, so for us, it's you know, it's great research, and it always adds to our storytelling to just go out and see what's going on in the city. So yes, it's a really super interesting moment that we're in right now. It barely needs to be said that we're in the midst of this, you know, big building boom, one of LA's periodic building booms. But one cost estimator I spoke with recently said he hasn't seen construction levels like we're seeing in the region at this level in his 30 years of working here. And I think it's fair to say that unlike some of our past booms, this one is taking the region perhaps in kind of quite a new direction in terms of its architecture, urban design, and mobility. Again, I'm slightly stating the obvious to a room full of experts, but we're looking around so much of the Southland and we're seeing an explosion of mid and high rise, of mixed use and higher density projects built close to our emerging transit lines, a greater emphasis being put on public space and on alternative modes of transit, from bike share through to expanded rail. Now, generally, in sort of our community, this growth is considered inherently a good thing, you know, steering us away from the suburban model of development predicated on the car that has kind of run its course. But how do we feel about the results? So much of this development is happening so fast, we barely have time to stop and think about its impact. And that, by that I mean one of its impacts could be that question of whether we're arriving at an economic mix. But for the purposes of today's discussion, I think we've agreed that what we're interested in is, are we creating good and distinctive architecture and urbanism? I emphasize distinctive. Right now on our show DNA, we're in the midst of a series that we're calling This Is Home, from the tent to the Giga Mansion and everything in between. And we're looking specifically at residential development. And we're sort of, the premise is that in the last century, LA developed residential models that were specific to the region, its lifestyle and economy. We can think of the ranch, Spanish style, case study houses, bungalow courts, garden apartments, on it goes. And we produced a mix of homes that were aimed at all income levels. So where are we today? Are we realizing house types, housing types, as well as commercial buildings that could be said to be specific and uniquely expressive of Los Angeles? Or, as LA continues on its inexorable journey towards, you know, global status, is our urban fabric also sort of going global and possibly generic? So anyway, we're very interested in this, and we've spoken to various people, and one of the people that we spoke with was DJ Waldy. I'm sure many of you know his name. He grew up next door in Holy Land and wrote the marvelous book. He grew up next door in Lakewood, and he wrote the book Holy Land about Lakewood, which he considers Holy Land. And he spent many years there as an information officer. So we were speaking to him about these questions, and he said, the question that troubles me now is that what's characteristic form for LA today? This is the question. We have accessory dwelling units. We hear about this a lot. We have tiny houses. We have all sorts of variations on some themes. We've got fantastical mega mansions. But among all those forms that are being built now, what is the characteristic Los Angeles house? I don't see one. This is what he said. Now, of course, we argued with him that the land-gobbling city of Lakewood mode of development that he so admires is really simply environmentally unsustainable these days, and he acknowledged that too. So then we got into this conversation of densification, and he says, yes, of course we do have to densify, but that we really have to kind of monitor and do properly. And he's critical of downtown LA. He thinks downtown LA is sort of not doing very well with its densification. But, and this is very pertinent to all of you in this room, he said downtown LA might be the wrong place to see the new Los Angeles being born. It might be more true to see that new Los Angeles being born in places like Glendale and Burbank or Long Beach, for example, which hardly anyone knows, but which is urbanizing in a relatively attractive way and is still retaining a certain beach town vibe to it. So I think that's a great place to start our conversation, and I'm going to ask both you, Scott and Alan, let's just respond to that. That point made by DJ Waldy. Is Long Beach urbanizing in a relatively attractive way?
You go ahead, Alan. Okay.
Loaded question.
You are at the center of it, so
Why not?
you've obviously thought about it a lot.
Sure. No, I think it's a really interesting point. First off, as a resident of Long Beach, I love that no one knows what we're doing down here because it means it's an amazing place to live. I think also, though, what we have particularly in downtown, what's happening is we have a beautiful mix of old and new. So a lot of communities, let's say Lakewood, which started as a field and then developed and now is trying to come back and redevelop, we have a relatively developed downtown. It has, like, I'm looking right out the window at some beautiful older buildings mixed with some newer buildings. And I think that takes a lot of the pressure off of each individual building. It doesn't have to be an epic masterpiece of architecture. It can do its job within the body of the city. So as long as it's a contributing member of the city, it helps create that vibrancy. So a lot of maybe a building that wouldn't work so well in West Hollywood works really well here because of that mix.
Alan?
I think we're doing a pretty good job. All those cities, Burbank, Glendale, Allen, Loomis, we mentioned he was in Santa Monica, he used to be in Glendale, are doing interesting jobs. I think that they started with good, walkable sort of blocks, and they're really streetcar sort of suburbs. And it is an interesting point when you think about Los Angeles. It is a polycentric place. So it is interesting to look at this dispersed development that's happening in these different cities. Are we creating great architecture? I don't think so. You know, I think that's a harder
Thing to accomplish?
Much harder thing to accomplish.
Does the architecture diminish when the urban design goes up? Like, is there an inverse relationship? Like when you're making place, are you less? Is the collection of forces that produce the environment less concerned with the individual building?
Maybe. I mean, let's just, we're amongst friends and talk, but even within our discussions that we have within our group, some of the designers are like, you're always talking about urbanism and respecting context and being a good neighbor, but we want to do something really cool. And the two sometimes go together, but sometimes they don't. So there is maybe there's a contrast there. I think there are some places doing it interestingly, but maybe it's, now that we've got the urbanism better, maybe now we can explore a bolder kind of architecture, if we could find ways to do that.
If you can have respect and bold, because those two can be in conflict. That's the point you're just making.
Sometimes. I don't want to sort of make a blanket statement there, but yeah, sometimes they can be.
Well, I'm sorry. What I'm thinking is, if you go back to Rem Koolhaas's Delirious New York, what's interesting about that, there's a diagram or a painting by Madeline Vriesendorp that is the grid. The urban grid is so strong that you can have iconic buildings. So he actually recreates New York using all these unbuilt projects. So Salvador Dali next to a fantasy OMA, next to a Gaudi-esque building, and none of them have anything to do with each other, but the grid is so strong that it holds them all together and still knits it into an interesting cityscape, a fantastical cityscape. Wolf Pre talks about this in the context of chess. He does it the opposite way, where he thinks the architecture is going to make the city. So you take a chessboard, you have all the chess pieces, and you take the board away. And would you get an interesting city? And I think what I'm advocating for, I think we talk about in a different way in the studio, is a really strong urban context, and that allows for more iconic architecture once that the urban fabric is intact.
Interesting, because those chessboards where the chessboard's been taken away can be those kind of architect tea parties where you get a bunch of different architects invited to the table, and then it doesn't make for good urbanism at all.
Absolutely not. Well, you get Brasilia, which is extraordinary architecture. It's like photographed so beautifully, and there's no people, because no people can actually occupy these spaces. But the objects themselves are fantastically beautiful. That's what you have on your wall when you're an architecture student. I can remember very clearly going from a drummer, and all my drum stuff came down one day, and all these buildings went up on the wall. And then as I came to the studio 20 years later, suddenly discovering like you can't actually make a city with those.
So is the grid the beat of the drum?
I believe
the thing
I've
that
never thought
holds
of it
the
that way.
tune together?
I think it actually is. There's all these different, not to go on a musical tangent, but there is an amazing drummer named Bill Bruford who was in a band called King Crimson, and King Crimson would do.
They're very famous.
They're very famous, right? But he would talk about it that you need that going, and then you can do something much more complex on top. But you need that backbeat that people can comprehend and have something to relate to. It happens in film through the protagonist. It happens in music through a backbeat or something. Some piece that is a through line that's very identifiable, and it lets you go off. It's what Miles did with, I'm blanking on the name, but the
Kind of Blue?
Kind of Blue, thank you, with Kind of Blue, with the modals, that you set up these modes of operation, and then that mode continues, and then you can solo over it freely because you've got that infrastructure.
Right.
I think that's the urban planning, that if the urban planning is strong enough, and I think to some discussions we've been having, flexible enough to allow other things to occur. That's that mix, right? So you can't be too deterministic. It can't be Albert Speer, which allows nothing to occur. But it also can't be Houston, which lets anything happen at any time. It's somewhere in that middle.
Since we deviated onto music,
Sorry.
Can I just stay on music for just a minute?
Please.
I'm just going to float very quickly a theory, and then we're going to get right back to
Right back on
LA
topic.
and Long Beach and Glendale and Burbank. No. So in those years that one heard lots of complaining about the Starchitect, and I would ask myself, like, sort of, is that fair? You know, that seems to be a very simplistic definition of an architect who's of a particular era that seems to be producing kind of very sort of, I guess, sort of showy buildings. So I thought about, you know, what makes an architect produce the kind of architecture that they produce? You know, what determines where they go? Is it their generation? Is it the school they went to? What are the forces? And then I started to wonder, is it the music that they loved? So Tom Main and his generation, you know, Zaha Rem, you know, you could call them the sort of the showy school of architecture, say, but they were the Rolling Stones, they were Pink Floyd, they were the big, like, massive band era, and they grew up with spectacle. Like, spectacle was the language, and they gave themselves names like bands, you know, like Morphosis, Co-op Himmelblau, you know, they were bands.
Yeah,
and in
Archigram.
fact, yes, and Wolf Prier has said that he's like worships Keith Richards.
Oh, absolutely.
So, and then if you then go to other generations, like the mid-century modernists, say they all love Miles Davis, they love jazz, you know, and their buildings perhaps.
Yeah, they're much lighter, and they're much more flexible, much more open.
Right, and then the generation that is now heading into their 30s and 40s that got very kind of sniffy about the star architects. What did they grow up with? Grunge, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So did grunge sort of feed into a slightly more kind of, I guess, sort of downplayed architecture or something? Anyway, it's just a theory that I thought about. And since you're a drummer, I thought you might have some thoughts on it.
And I'm past the 30s and 40s, so I'm back into the Pink Floyd era.
You're King Crimson.
I'm King Crimson.
So what building would you do?
Well, I mean, cards on the table. My favorite architect is Wolf Prier. So.
Oh.
Okay. I don't work that way, and I never worked with him intentionally because I knew I would just get consumed by the work, and I would never have my own voice. So I never worked for him.
Huh.
I turned down the opportunity,
but anyway, the beat goes on. The beat goes on. Okay, so back to Burbank, Glendale, and I think we should include Santa Monica actually, even though Don Waldy didn't say Santa Monica himself.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think we should put Santa Monica into a city that is definitely thinking very much about how it's developing. Okay, so you have an office in downtown in downtown LA, as well as downtown Long Beach. So you're in a good position to look at how the two centers are urbanizing.
Right.
Back to Waldy, who's fresh in our minds, we asked him, Avishai and I, you know, well, sort of, what's your concern with downtown LA? And he said, downtown has its special problems. The street grid is very confining downtown. The infrastructural aspects of downtown are sometimes difficult. It's wearing out faster because it's been harder used. Now, he acknowledges, I guess I'm a true suburbanite, but at some point you need enough urban life, but not too much urban life. I thought that was really interesting and perhaps quite personal, but still, downtown LA urbanizing successfully. It seems to be a bit of a hodgepodge right now.
Well, because you know you have different areas with different eras. So if you take a walk in downtown, you start in the financial district. It's actually pretty successful, and it's a people space. But if you go up and you walk, let's say up Bunker Hill, and then you get into a 1970s or 80s version of what a downtown should be. It's removed from human scale, really wide streets. Even Grand Avenue, all the work, is still not a human place to walk. And the walk is actually really arduous. You know, the crossings are really long, and there's lots of places where there's no connectivity. And the buildings are just this super high scale corporate architecture.
Right.
And then you walk down the hill to Broadway, and you come back to human scale, and you walk down Spring. And so downtown is a hodgepodge because it was built in different eras.
It was built, and then there was that strange thing that happened with Bunker Hill where they got rid of all the residential where it made sense, flipped, and put the office and civic on the hill where you should typically have residential up on the hill, and then the residential winds up down in the basin.
Yeah, but by building Bunker Hill, they saved the historic core.
Yeah, they did.
Because
That's
otherwise
an unintended consequence.
Yeah, which is a good one. They would have torn it down. And when you go to the old bank district, and we have some people that live there, it's a great scale. It feels like a great city. I don't think it's too much urbanism. So when Don says, well, downtown has too much, what part of downtown? South Park or Arts Village? Because it really is. It was built in these different phases, and it's really it's inconsistent and a little promiscuous in the architecture. But I kind of like it. I have to say, I love downtown. I love downtown here, and I love the downtown that's happening in Los Angeles. And I remember, many of us remember when downtown seemed kind of hopeless, and to see it so vibrant is to me a great urban success story.
Oh, it's incredible. But it says something about where LA is going. Obviously, I mean, did you move here in the 90s? Or were you here already?
Early 90s.
Early, me too, early 90s.
Yeah.
And one went to downtown for a kind of spooky experience.
Yes, yeah.
Just to drive around.
Right.
Just to drive around and be in a ghost town.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
it was fascinating.
Yeah, and it was, like, wow, how could this ever come about? How could it change? But
well, it was an ordinance. So let's get to things that can really just sort of flip the switch. The historic adaptive reuse ordinance seemed to be a pivotal move that changed downtown Los Angeles.
And also, you also need catalytic people. I don't have a big man theory of things, but if we didn't have Ira Yellen and Wayne Rakovich and Tom Gilmore, it may have gone in a different direction.
Right.
Maybe it would have, other people would have stepped in there, but we needed those people to step in and take advantage of those ordinances and have the vision and the courage to ask bankers. I know this looks like a crack house and there's people dying here every day.
It is.
I want you to give you millions of dollars.
You mean it is? It still is.
It is. And well, it was. And when they were pitching that, it literally was that. And then I think you're absolutely right. Having the vision and the nerve to say, I'm going to stake my claim in the bank district, like Tom did.
Yeah. And so that goes to the ethos of the people. I mean, we could talk about architecture very abstractly, but there is, but you talk about the music people listen to. Well, the music is part of the culture people grow, but the ethos of the people, the leaders, the people that are leading change, a really interesting story in cities that isn't always told.
Absolutely, yes, completely agree. In fact, Stephen G., who is a historian of Los Angeles architecture, has made a film recently about John Parkinson. John Parkinson, who had kind of really disappeared into the mists of time in terms of the general public knowing the name and knowing the huge amount of civic buildings that he built. And he sort of surfaced that name. And I think it's very interesting to hear that story, because his point is we all know a lot about the designers of residential buildings in Los Angeles, and we know really relatively little about the designers of our civic fabric, which says something about LA's values, I guess, which may be changing now.
And that, I think, to me, what's interesting about thinking about the people is the champions that are commissioning buildings. If you have people that actually care about the community or invested in the community and are commissioning buildings that they want to leave a legacy to, you'll get a kind of building. But if it's a faceless global investment firm that's looking at just a return on investment, which is what, frankly, a lot of what we see happening, especially we're building a lot of multifamily housing, and a lot of that money is just kind of, global finance. We may not get the same kind of city. And the values that those buildings have are different than the sort of civic values that we're also searching for. What is that civic value of what the region is? What makes Long Beach unique? and Long Beach and Burbank what it is, and downtown what it is. Those are the kind of discussions we try to have, but it's an interesting subject.
It is an interesting subject because LA does seem to be at this point of kind of tension between, well, maybe it's an old standing tension between what it is and what it wants to be. So if we look back to 1950s, 1960s, one of the really busy architects was William Pereira. Right now, we're having a kind of William Pereira buildings about to be torn down moment. You know, the LA Times, the Metropolitan Water District, all going. And even though people accept that his LACMA buildings were not his greatest piece of work, nonetheless, William Pereira could probably be said to be really regional, like a really regional modernist. And that building is being replaced by, you know, a global architect, I guess one could say, to go back to that terminology.
You're talking about Peter Zumthor's blobby building.
The expansion. And, you know, and as you've said, a lot of the multifamily structures, global money coming in. Are we trading something away for getting the brand developers, the brand architects coming in?
Well, again, I think that's what, you know, we're trying to figure out a little bit. You know, how do we create something that's really about a local culture when some of these commercial buildings, I'll call a multifamily building commercial, is really about just returning investment to a sort of unseen face. I think that's where it's an interesting thing. And do people, and then the other question that's a little deeper, do people care? What do we have enough shared values as a city to sort of enforce, like, we want it to be this way. We want our buildings to speak to us in this way. I think there's a lot of friction that's happening in cities right now between the populace, that many of them think we're big enough, we can't continue building, and others that want a certain kind of style. Those are the discussions that we're constantly having. And we do have some sort of democracy, and community groups can talk about buildings in a way that they weren't able to before. I think that's kind of interesting. But are we taking advantage of that?
Right. Well, are we taking advantage of it, or are we going too far with, because obviously there's this big push and pull between the forces of growth and change and the forces of resistance and trying to stop growth. And you know, where do you find the sweet spot, and when do we go too far towards sort of the community voice influencing development to the point that perhaps it isn't bold, you know, or it's too small in ambition, and how do we find a balance between ambition and modesty?
Should there be democracy in design?
And how do you manage that democracy?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because obviously you want people to have a say in their community, but a lot of the results are pretty awful. When there's too many, it's the old, you know, it's the camel. Or the platypus.
Designed by committee, yes.
Designed by committee, where it's a little bit of this, a little bit of this, a little bit of this, and then you get it together and no one likes it at all, including the architect. And then who is this idiot architect who built this? And it came out of a process that's well-meaning, but maybe not the result that we want. So, but on the other hand, I don't want myself just imposing something on a community, you know, out of nowhere. So I think, you know, obviously we do things, we try not to do that. There are certainly architects, I don't want to name a name, who that's their entire business plan.
The entire business plan is
to impose their will on a community, and the community be damned. So it's a tough balancing act. I wanted to jump back real quick, just not to totally derail this, but to go back to your discussion about, you know, it's the tear down William Pereira moment, which is an interesting moment to be in. I can think of other ones that we could add to that list other than William Pereira, but that's another balancing act, which is that the city's starting to mature enough that these buildings that were once this optimistic, completely opposed vision to, I think, what our vision of the city is now. They're car-centric, they're set way back, they rely on parking. Now we want, you know, active street life, we want, you know, people on bikes, we want people walking, we want people working, living near where they work. It's a very different community that the Pereira buildings, as one example, don't support. In fact, they actively fight, in my opinion. So one position, so I think I lean more towards, is they need to go so that this new city can occur. But I have friends who are deeply committed to the complete other position, and I think
The complete other position
being
to
save
preserve,
everything.
preserve,
Preserve,
where you go
preserve,
too far
preserve.
with preservation.
Correct. And so you can drown in preservation or you can drown in demolition. So I just wanted to throw that out just real quick before we pass on to other more probably interesting subjects.
Oh, I don't think it's more, I don't think that is less interesting than what I think it's completely germane. I think that's very well put. So say it again, you said we go in the direction of too much demolition.
Too much drown in demolition or drown in preservation.
No, it's a really, really interesting question. I mean, right now, I guess Avishai and I, one of the segments that we did as part of our series was we looked at this ADU, this prototypical ADU in Highland Park. The ADU is meant to be a benefit to the homeowner who's agreed to have the ADU put in their backyard. It's meant to produce revenue for that homeowner as well as contribute to the city's goal of providing more affordable housing. The ADU has run into cost overruns, and according to the folks that we spoke to, one of the contributory factors is the HPOZ. That seems to be absolutely tyrannical about
You might want to just explain what HPOZ is.
Sorry. Don't you have HPOZs in Long Beach?
They're not called that.
Oh, what are they called?
Historic districts.
Oh, well, anyway, historic preservation overlay zones, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, where a whole, I think they're meant to come out of a democratic process, where a community, a neighborhood votes to preserve its fabric, and I think in return there's some kind of tax benefits, aren't there? If you
there can be,
but they're quite restrictive. They lay there on their own rules, but they can be quite restrictive about the styling, the details, the materials, setbacks, all sorts of things. And so anyway, the HPOZs are metastasizing. You know, they're popping up all over, and with mixed. It's the same thing. Do we want to preserve ourselves into
a completely catalyzed city? You can't do anything.
Wait, I grew up in one of those cities.
Yes.
I grew up in
which I love, by the way.
Bath. Bath is beautiful.
It's beautiful,
to visit,
and then you leave.
Makes you crazy if you want to actually do anything. So you have to be careful with HPOZs because you don't want to go too far, and yet you don't want to lose all your fabric. And of course, the people that want the HPOZs, one of the reasons why is because they hate the McMansionization of the neighborhoods.
Absolutely.
Or the little darling, little Spanish, exactly that. So it's how do you find the balance? Now, let's go back to Waldy's sort of primary point, which is back to, are we managing to produce an LA voice? Is the development that we're seeing in downtown Long Beach that's fresh and new, is it sort of specifically of here, even when it's these global developers that come in and invest, or could it be found in London? Could it be found on the East Coast? Is there something that's specific to our codes, to the way we build, to the materials we choose?
Well, you know, one interesting thing, just hearing that quote and thinking about that quote, he was saying that the new LA is emerging in places. So I think when he says LA, he's talking about the LA region.
Totally.
And he says it's emerging in places like Burbank and Glendale and Long Beach where no one heard of. What's interesting about the way we govern, see, I always get frustrated that we have 88 cities in one county, and there's almost no regional sort of strategy about the place. So that's frustrating. But you know what's interesting about the quote is, but it's also freeing, because here we know we can go talk to City Hall and our planning director. He might even, or she might even be here right now. I don't think so. But
no, he left.
We know who they are. It's small enough that you can actually have that kind of discussion about what do we want downtown to be, and what do we want the east side or North Long Beach or Midtown. We can have that discussion, and Glendale probably can have that discussion, and Santa Monica is always having that discussion. So there's something about a governance that's kind of regionally really mass, but like each city might have more of a chance to get themselves right. And so that's an interesting dichotomy living in this region that I think is really interesting. Now, that being said, are we producing great architecture that represents the best of Long Beach? I think that it's a mixed bag. Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. And maybe there'll be people that say architecture is really important, but we really have to have better policies about displacement, gentrification, and we have to have better policies about building more housing and let's not worry about how much it looks like, because that could add a lot of cost too, just like HPOZ. And on the other side, it's all about is the fundamental thing keeping the character of this place, growing at such a rate that we still keep the character. And what is that character?
Yeah, what is that character? And does the character become what Brian writes so much about, which is the urban realm and the shared spaces, the spaces in between.
Right.
The spaces in between, which goes back to your point that you made right at the beginning of our discussion, which is in creating urbanism, are we losing architecture?
Yeah, exactly. I think about the music thing too. Like maybe each city needs to have its own soundtrack.
Right.
Like
so what would be Long Beach's soundtrack?
I don't know. You guys have any ideas?
Who?
Sublime.
Snoop Dogg. There we go.
There we go.
There we go. But that's interesting because that's a specific person that you've singled out, rather than
a genre.
A genre. Yeah. Would it be rap? Would it be rap? Or
I think that's probably the primary
hip-hop?
voice. But I think what's interesting about LA in particular is it wouldn't be one soundtrack.
It wouldn't be one soundtrack.
Because everyone's got their iPods, everyone's got it on random, and they're listening to a million things. So my iPod is that, and classical, and experimental, and art. It's everything, and things pop up randomly. And I think that's a much more interesting city than our city is about X.
Do you know, I believe there's a radio show called Morning Becomes Eclectic.
Yes, there is. And they do exactly that. My soundtrack's even more eclectic.
But that's why we love LA.
Absolutely.
For that eclecticism.
Absolutely.
And that brings me actually to a point. You guys sent me the article, the interview with Rem Koolhaas that was published in the Washington Post. And I think if we just make a sort of concluding point here and then throw the floor open to questions. But about this issue of eclecticism and the freeingness, the freedom of being 88 cities that doesn't have this overarching control. I guess Rem Koolhaas was interviewed and he was asked about the digital city, the future city, the autonomous driving city, et cetera, and how were cities globally, which cities were kind of prepared for this kind of really this future that's very hard to prepare for. And this is what Koolhaas said. I would say cities that are more open and not so complex to operate are best prepared for whatever the future throws at them. Los Angeles is the prototype of this kind of habitat for the future. So that's our kind of where next question, which is this devolved LA that does kind of elude control, set us up in a good way?
Actually, I sort of read his quote a little differently, which is that LA was ready to combat that.
LA was ready to combat
that.
What?
So autonomous car, completely digital, smart city, that it was a dumb city, and that was a positive thing.
Oh,
that's how I read the article, because Rem is so anti that. He's so clearly anti the smart city in most of his writings. He talks about it, but he talks about it as this dystopian hellhole.
Right.
In fact,
he also doesn't like LA.
No, he hates LA at one level, but there's also this sort of fascination with LA. So there's a couple of ways. First off, I read it that I think he thinks LA can combat that inevitable future. So it's not just by and large and everyone getting into their car and hoping they make their destination. That there's also, it was a warning that the area that he's in with Utrecht and Rotterdam and a couple other ones I'm not going to remember, he was saying that's in the early stages, in essence, of becoming LA. And so LA is almost an endpoint to that kind of a growth pattern. And
which is nodes of concentrated
nodes
development.
of concentration and sort of taking a city, let's take Shanghai, and then just sort of spreading it out. Butter scraped over too much bread. And which is kind of an amazing place in its own weird way. And like Wolf Preed talks about it as a romantic place. Rem sort of romanticizing that vision of LA. There's a number of European architects who do that. They look at LA as this so different, so unique, because it's so car-centric, as opposed to most cities, which have that a little bit, but not nearly as devoted.
Well, because they have alternatives.
They have actual alternatives in cities and countries that invest in their people. rather than invest in finance and banks and putting people in front instead of finance, which I think is not LA. LA is the exact opposite. People are an inconvenience to the city as a financial instrument. So that financial instrument's doing incredibly well. And the people in the city maybe aren't, and I think most people in the financial industry don't really care. And that's a different kind of city. And it's an inevitable city in a way as globalization occurs. That's a really good one to wrap up with. Yeah, sorry.
No, I mean, it's definitely. I agree with you. The Avishai and I were just talking as we drove down here about Reaganism and to what extent we've developed this sort of culture of wealth to the exclusion of
everybody.
Civitas, yes, of everybody else but a few. So it's obviously a sort of massive, mega issue that we really should all be discussing. But in terms of financial instrumentalization of our environment, can you just single out a specific part of town or specific buildings that are reflecting that? Is it in the lack of affordable housing, or is
I think it's that lack of affordable. That's a really good way. I'll try to summarize it very quickly because I know we need to get to the questions and answers. When I was looking for home in the mid-90s, I was sat down. It's like, look, you need to look at 30% of your gross income is what you should allocate for housing. I'm like, okay, great. And I was not wealthy, but I was doing okay. I had a little bit of money saved up. We could put down enough to actually buy a home. And I just read today, literally, that's now the threshold for affordable housing. Not just anybody's housing, that you need to have at least 30% of your gross income to get the cheapest housing available, right? And just to rent.
Yes.
And it gets even worse because we're speaking to another group of young people who are in their 20s, and they were saying that they need to allocate up to 70% as a roommate. That's completely dysfunctional as a city. And I think I think to our credit as a studio, we're working with really great clients who are actively trying to solve that problem. It's a difficult problem. It's maybe not even an architectural problem. It's a much larger political issue. That we do our best with prefabrication, other things that we can do to help with that. The Nightingale housing in Australia is another really great way of tackling that, where you cut the architect out, you cut the developer out, and you build it yourself.
What's the name of the housing?
Nightingale housing.
Oh, Nightingale. Oh, yeah.
It's an extraordinary other alternative model for providing homes.
But don't we also need a housing work policy? It seems like they're not connected.
Totally.
So we build houses, but they seem to be built completely independent of their proximity to work.
Yeah, absolutely. All those things happen. And actually, I've been working with both principals on affordable housing, and we just heard the other day, an affordable housing unit now costs $450,000 to construct. My house is nowhere near that, and I have an actual house on a piece of land.
That gets then to these other forces that are shaping LA today, HPOZs, regulations of all manner, which have increased over the decades. And there's good arguments for lots of them, but when you get competing demands made on a project and they don't necessarily harmonize, and then up goes the costs. And
we do this on a daily basis, where you look at something that you know exactly why that regulation is in place. It's a good regulation, it does good things, but you also know that just added 10% to the overall cost of that project, which is pushing that housing unit that should be $200,000 up to $450,000.
Right. So do you want Houston?
No, Houston doesn't solve the problem.
You said that earlier.
Yeah, it doesn't. It's a completely different way, because then what happens is the land is so valuable that you build the tallest, highest, biggest thing. It's also, Houston's traditionally been, like I know one of my old bosses was a principal at CRSS, and they used to actually build fake buildings for the oil industry just to park their money. So you would build an empty shell, wouldn't put anything in it, and then tear it down. And it was a way of just hiding money for tax purposes.
Like the condos in New York?
Like the condos in New York, exactly. It was a way of parking your money and hiding it. It grew by McKelly CE, unfortunately, not McKelly's fault, but the store was actually a way of laundering money. And the store didn't have to do anything. And
You're
so
referring to Michele Sai, the architect?
yeah, he's extraordinary design. He got to do an amazing thing, but it's because the project was intended not to make money. It was to actually like just run money through and clean it. He had nothing to do with that. He did the right thing, did an amazing design, had no part in the illegal part of that store. But it did do all those other things, and that's a part of that problem.
There's quite a few examples of.
There are.
Yeah.
There are.
Gosh. Well, I think we should throw it open to questions now. Do we? A question over here. Should I run over with the mic? I think. Or you come. Why don't you come a bit closer?
Come on up.
There we go.
We can run around too.
Yeah, we can run around too.
Here's the question podium.
Well, let's do this.
There we go. The question podium. That's good.
Okay, so what do you see as the relationship to kind of this densification going on in Long Beach, in a city primarily of commuters? It seems odd to create, we talked about scale, like now more walkable, and we have bike lanes, but people are still riding bikes on the sidewalk because they don't know how to do that yet. Use the lanes, and building to a different scale and densification, but yet most people in the city get up and drive to downtown LA every morning. And so what is the relationship to kind of like are we creating more housing or densification for commuters, or for people to actually actively participate in kind of mixed use buildings where they're getting their coffee, they're working there? Like, it seems a little bit of a disconnect, and wondering if you could expand and open that up.
Good question, because I don't know if you know this, but it's like 73% or 74% of Long Beach residents work out of the city, because we're like Santa Monica is the opposite, right? There's more jobs than people. Here, there are more people than jobs. So they go out, they just don't go to downtown, they go to the South Bay, and they go to Irvine, and actually it makes Long Beach kind of a desirable place to live because it's sort of between big job centers. We don't have a big job center. Well, ultimately the city's trying to build more job centers, and that's an economic development strategy of the city. It's also trying to get people that do live here to have good jobs no matter where they are, so they could spend money in the city. But what's happening, let's say downtown, is you'll see a lot of development of housing, and those people will maybe be driving out, but maybe they'll take the train. Maybe they'll be working downtown. We have a lot of people that work here that live and work downtown. The main big theory is that if you build a mixed-use community, you might not get rid of your car, but the idea is to use it less. So if you live down here and you do drive Monday through Friday someplace else, but on Saturday you can walk to all the things you need, and you're not using the car, and you're reducing your vehicle miles traveled. And that's sort of the big theory that SCAG and the state have imposed on all cities, is to build density no matter where you are, so that you might not get rid of the car, but you're hopefully getting people to drive that car less. And so that's sort of the philosophy there.
Yeah, and then I think we're involved actually in a couple projects that are increasing the job. I can't talk about them because they're in process, but they are doubling their workforce, which is getting more people. Most of those people actually live in the city. So that's starting to shift, but it's going to be 20, 30 years of shifting.
Yeah, and I'm sorry. So we don't have we're multi-centered city with jobs spread around the region. It's always going to be that way. We're not going to have one, like a New York or a London where there's one central business where most of the jobs are. So no matter what you do, people are going to be traveling. So we're struggling with that. That's one of our biggest mobility challenges. But it really is affecting how we think about cities in a little bit different way.
When you started, you described the idea of urbanism that's successful. And I didn't know what the presupposition behind that is, but I really wanted to know from all of you if you could just define for me what successful urbanism means.
That's a great question. That probably should have set the tone of it. What makes a great city?
Good urbanism.
Yeah, we just assume we know.
There are like different metrics. The UN has different metrics of what makes a successful city, whether it's safety, health expectancy, health outcomes, Gini differences being like the the economic equality, opportunity, and education. There's so many different metrics we could talk about. I don't know if there's any one that says this is the metric for a city, but I have lots of lists that we could use, of what makes a successful city, and it's defined probably by each city and each individual family. It could be upward mobility, or it could be life expectancy, and if you just measure, by the way, if you measure our cities against other developed world cities, we don't actually do that well in the U.S.
We do or we don't?
We don't. We
Right.
don't.
Well, that's because of you factor in healthcare, access to healthcare. You factor in, I guess, economic equity. There's
Access
a
to
very
housing,
big
yeah.
access to housing, very big disparity between wealth and poverty. I think right now, good urbanism, as we understand it. Do you want me to hand you back the mic?
No.
No. Alan has a mic on him.
I have.
Oh, you have the mic.
I
Yeah.
have a mic.
I think right now the understood idea of good urbanism in LA is the urbanism that is pushing back against suburbanization. I think it's anything that has to do with widening sidewalks, putting in bike lanes, getting density closer to transit lines. I think those are the good urban goals right now, aren't they, for LA?
Yeah.
Obviously, as the questioner who just posed the last question.
Right there.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Last question over there. First question over there.
Right. But you posed the question about what's the point of having downtown density if, in fact, the people living in the density are not walking and working right close to where they're living? Because obviously LA does throw up these bizarre contradictions. We're trying to achieve the urbanism that we associate with Paris or New York or wherever, but we just don't live like that. We're a region. We don't have work and housing connected in that way. So anyway, it is complicated. Again, Avishai and I, we had a long drive down here, so we got to talk about a lot. And one of the things that we were talking about was the residential towers in downtown, and to what extent are those kind of humane? The taller they go, are they kind of less and less sort of human places to live in? And then, of course, in some cities in the world, you can live in a 50-story tower, and it's perfectly normal, and it wouldn't be questioned and seen as inhumane. So Hong Kong, yes.
Yeah, Vancouver.
Yes. Vancouver, yeah, although Vancouver has those sort of stumpy high-rises,
Yeah, but
don't
they're
they?
still
They're
relatively.
right.
Not 50 stories, you're
They're
right.
not Burj Khalifa at all.
True.
But anyway, does that answer your question about the urbanism, or is actually it deeply unsatisfying? Oh, there you go.
Oh,
You're the expert.
Sure. I've got a mic.
Oh, you've got a mic.
I think for me, it is that transition away from the car into this sort of a more polycentric, or not polycentric, just a city more like Copenhagen. I think Copenhagen, in some ways, is the model. So Copenhagen, if you go back 25 years, it's cars. It looks like LA, actually. People are parked on sidewalks. No one's walking. People they're living in downtown. They're going out to their jobs at factories. And then slowly, and I think it takes a long time, they're slowly moving back into city centers. So I'd hope that it's that.
So I'm a big fan of Christopher Alexander, who wrote Pattern Language.
Yeah.
And he talks about organic cities and cohesion. And so when I was asking the question, those ideas for creating a human-centered city, which it seems like a lot of what's being spoken about has that
Is that.
elements in it, but it doesn't seem as though there's like a visionary understanding of what specifically good
Correct.
urbanism means. And if we are moving back away from car culture,
Mm-hmm.
then that's a movement that, like, when people ask questions about why is there parking coming into, like, somebody had mentioned the parking issue,
Uh-huh.
but then people aren't using the bike lanes. If people don't understand the vision of what we're doing, then it's always this very hodgepodge kind of thing that goes on consistently without everybody being kind of like on a page where we know that we're moving
Right.
in this direction.
Right.
Right. I think so much of Los Angeles was driven at a certain point by its industries. Aerospace, landed communities in certain places. Obviously, Hollywood. I think because our work has become so untethered that I don't know that there is a kind of large collective economic sort of driving force That so we're just all muddling along, I feel, and then you throw in the housing prices, and
I think most cities muddle along, though.
Yeah.
Honestly. But what interesting about the question is, we can talk about a big philosophy of what makes a successful city. But I think what's interesting is, what do we want to measure to see if we're making it? Like, what are the metrics? Is it health? Is it education? Is it upward mobility? Is it integration? I mean, that's what's really interesting about that question.
Yeah.
Because I'm looking at the outcomes. Okay, well, yeah, we have a philosophy of what makes a better city.
Right.
And we're going to get rid of cars. Are we going to be healthier for it? Is our environment?
Right.
All those kind of things.
At this point, Alan, may I
Well, I want
may
to
I
make sure that
Oh,
we
wait,
have-
there's a couple more questions.
Oh yes, okay, sure.
Let's-
Sorry,
let's-
Alan. I wanted you
we'll
to
get
talk
to
about
Alan in one
wellness in
second.
Santa Monica.
Yeah, but I think Josh has been patient there.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask this question. I wanted to ask you to comment on Richard Florida's Rise of the Creative Class versus his new urban crises. And is a city like Long Beach, which I would argue perhaps overinvested in the first book, do we need to go back and look at the second book really quickly and make sure that as we modernize and create a new urban environment, that we're not leaving literally tens of thousands of people behind as we do so?
Good question. I mean, unintended consequences. We came up with a community plan a couple of years ago to revitalize the downtown, and I think it's working, but nothing in the community plan says, okay, when you have this downtown that becomes really vital and there's a lot of development pressure, how do you put in something about anti-displacement or anti-gentrification or things that protect some of the people from the shocks of our kind of crazy neoliberal real estate market? I think that's something that we should be thinking about. I think people are thinking about it. Just now it's like, how do you implement it? But I think it's always good to say, yeah, we want to revitalize it, but there's a dark side to all that stuff, and I think cities are looking at that right now.
It's interesting that you bring up Florida because I always had a fundamental problem with the notion of the creative class. This notion that there was these creatives with startups, techies, and that somehow they were different and special and needed to be sort of built for, while nurses and teachers were kind of not creative somehow. I mean, it literally made me crazy. And I think it's been problematic. And I think that Richard Florida himself, because we interviewed Richard about the second book a few months ago, and I feel like he's gone through a bit of a...
He has a bit of a regret, maybe.
Yeah, I think there is some level of regret. And he claims to be, what was it, Avishai? He claimed to be like a Marxist-Leninist or something when we were speaking to him. I mean, this guy who'd completely provided neoliberals with the fodder to be financial. Yeah, but he was literally claiming to be like a left-wing economist and seemed to be very much aware that something had gotten lost in the mix, which was like regular people. And he claims to be such a fan of Jane Jacobs, but if you read Jane Jacobs, of course, the cities that she wanted, mixed economic classes, and were the opposite of sort of creating this notional class.
Yeah. Although, again, talking about HPO, the historic preservation, Greenwich Village is anything but a mix of classes.
No, of course, and that's an unintended consequence of Jane Jacobsism,
Right.
Yeah, and in fact, preservationists will use her to support anti-growth arguments. No, it is complicated. It is. Next question, since we can't answer this one.
My question is, can I talk?
Please.
Is there anyone else that would like to speak instead of me? Yeah? You're next. When I was a school teacher, I would ask if there were any questions. But then I'd immediately follow it with, when no hands went up, are there any answers? So we have a problem of perspective. So briefly, I won't launch into too much me talk, but I went to USC to study architecture in the late 60s, and when it was the Auteur, Buckminster Fuller, etc. there. And then the next year I went up to Berkeley, and suddenly I was studying environmental design with Christopher Alexander, etc. So the perspective shifted from architecture to environmental design, and we're still in architecture now, 50 years later, which Buckminster Fuller would point out. There's a delay in every solution being implemented, and we're still trying to solve yesterday's problems with tomorrow's big stomp on us right around the corner, if not now. A little illustration might be, and I love Surfrider, but the big energy going into tearing down part of the breakwater to get surf is going to immediately create a problem of protecting the houses on the peninsula. I'm not here to push that. I'm just saying that's an example of what we're not thinking about. California's water is coming from the fossil water. We're not getting rain. What are we going to drink? And my point is, we're not looking into the future and solving the problems that are coming. We're looking at what happened. I might love that building that got torn down. That's my problem. The real problem is, what are we going to drink and how are we going to supply everyone? Because there's no egalitarian system anymore. It's all about the money, and it's all going up. If the environmental designers don't see the environment and you be part of it as a human being biologically, your building is going to be empty because you won't be in it. Even if you bought it, it's over.
On that happy note.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Was there a question? I don't know if there was.
No, he said as a teacher, he would sometimes say, are there any questions? And then he'd say, are there answers?
Okay.
Let's go to a question.
Anyone? No.
Oh, that's Andrea.
No, it's this gentleman right here.
I wanted to ask, because you're talking about grunge music and Rolling Stones being like the genres connected to the generations of architects. How are we as a city, specifically here in Long Beach, are we dealing with the influence of suburbanism and suburbanites, becoming architects, the generation of people who grew up in the suburbs becoming architects and developing in cities, because that's a foreign concept to many of them because they grew up the descendants of people trying to move away from inner cities. I ask that because, contrary to what you were just saying, ma'am, this is a city built upon a very particular industry. That's the port. $15 billion a year comes out of the port. So I would argue that that's the most important industry, the most important job here in this city. This is the gateway to China and the Asian market, and it's going to continue to be important as containerization, especially at the foreign port workers. So this is important to me. But I ask about the influence of suburbanites because, as the port becomes more and more important, and we live in a time where people are, heavily protesting things like the LUE here, and which is the future. Speaking about the future, see, I'm tying into you. How do we try to not fix the problems of people? We have people who moved, their parents moved, they were federally subsidized through things like the GI Bill to move into places like Lakewood, places like Glendale, places like Burbank, outside of the city, and now we have their children moving back into the city, dictating policy. What is the ways that we can kind of combat the effect of suburbanization here in a major city?
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Long Beach.
What do you think is the answer?
I mean, you really want to know. I'll tell you, affordable housing is definitely the answer. Rent control, rent stabilization of some sort is definitely the answer, because you're talking about building a city. What was the man he was talking earlier? This is a city of commuters. This is a city of commuters because we're not facilitating living situations and living conditions that major industries, for example, Tesla wanted to build a plant here only a couple of years ago, And one of the major reasons for why they didn't want to build it here is because there wasn't enough living spaces for the workers that are going to come. So we're trying to build for the future, but we're ignoring, who provides that. Right now they're about to dismantle for over 9 months the Blue Line, which is the lifeblood of majority of service workers in the entire LA County. It's you build the Expo line where only the average 10,000 people are using it per day, and you're going to take out the Blue Line where you have over 90 to 125,000 people using it a day. And the only reason that we even have to dismantle it in the first place is because suburbanites were dictating policy. We're like, hey, we don't want major railways or major public transportation coming into our areas because of the type of people that use it. So you can speak on it.
No, I can't. We're visiting Long Beach. Yeah.
Oh, here.
So as you're talking, there's two things that occurred to me. One, you talked about affordable housing. And the other thing, which is completely on the other end of the spectrum to me, is somehow talking about organizing the city in urbanism. Okay, so those are the two topics. One, with regard to affordable housing, one of the things that has happened that is probably out of our control, but we can influence, it seems to me, is when you think about Santa Monica and the whole Silicon Beach area, for example, the tech companies came in, and all of a sudden, particularly in the last 5 years, there's been, as everybody knows, a dramatic increase in price of housing. Come to find out that the lenders have been allowing individuals that have stock options to use those stock options to qualify for a loan that they probably can't pay for. Mm-hmm. But now the damage is done. So how do we, and I don't know that we have an answer for it, but I'm just putting it out there as a contemplation for the future. How do we avoid that in other places, as you talk about Amazon, #2 and things like this happening, maybe Tesla, that kind of thing. So maybe it's something for everybody to think about as you're going forward, and we have an opportunity to stop things that maybe were adverse. So that's one thing. With regard to the fabric of the city, when I think about LA and the Rem Koolhaas sort of thought and that kind of thing, I guess my question is, how do you feel, what I observe about downtown LA, for example, the greater downtown LA area, is that while it's evolving, I think there's still an opportunity. And I see like the Arts District is sort of, I would equate to Greenwich Village in New York. And then you've got, and then you've got the Civic Center, you've got the sports and entertainment. So how do you feel about that, for that kind of urban area, which to me is going to be a far different answer than Long Beach, which is probably more like equatable to Santa Monica. So how do you feel about that kind of districting notion?
Well, look, I think that there are going to be neighborhoods. We talked about one of the reasons is they get developed over different times and they have different uses. So you have South Park with all the sports and entertainment. I don't like that much, but that's okay, because that's for some people to go to. There's other parts of South Park that are residential neighborhoods. I just think that we have to the problem with downtown to me is that it all has to stitch together. It's a series of districts that aren't always well connected. And I think, right, well,
Yep.
That's true. There's that big
For now.
donut.
Fortunately, it's probably getting pushed out.
Yeah. But I mean, the point though, that I think what needs to happen in all of LA is stitching those different districts together. I think neighborhoods are great, and even in New York and other cities in London, there are different neighborhoods with different characters, but they're well stitched together. What we're trying to do is do that in a way that isn't just by the car, but is walkable and bikeable.
So how do you do that? If there are, as we all know, design review boards and things like that, which tie into in the city of LA, at least, into the sort of overarching plan. So do you think that that's the way to do it? Or do you think that there should be a overall city master plan that gets pushed down?
Well, what the city's doing is using these community plans that they're updating, and I think that's a pretty good tool, just like we had one here for developing each area. And then there's DOT and the people that are citywide looking at streets and other citywide systems.
So you kind of agree with this?
I think it works. I can't think of a better one. Now, I want to do a time check, though.
Yeah, we've got time for one more question.
One more question.
Yes. Yeah.
Sure.
I'm really angry at the way this white woman took over his question and you allowed it. What? I mean, this man had questions and wanted answers.
No.
She stood up and commandeered the conversation and turned it in a different direction. Let's stop doing that.
Sure.
I thought she was going to build on that question. And she did not. She commandeered and made it wrong. So let's go back to the point and let's answer his damn questions.
One, we were going to go back, but two, we actually asked him for the answer. He gave the answer. So you're asking for an answer on an answer.
He asked for your commentary and then she
Actually, what I was going to say to him, and I was waiting for my opportunity, but I wasn't going to start doing ad hominem attacks on anyone in the room. Really don't think that's appropriate either. But what I was going, because I did think his analysis is very interesting, and he got right at the thing that I question about the entire region, which is work-life connection, and to what extent city planners are able to think about that, to what extent one does need to have regional organizations like SCAG, putting that piece together, because you are, what is your name? Sanai is, of course, absolutely right. I was thinking aerospace is the great generator. Of course it's the port. And, you know, to what, I mentioned Alan earlier. Alan's with the city of Santa Monica, you know, where, as this Alan said a moment ago, that more people are coming into Santa Monica to work than can live there. Santa Monica almost doubles in population daily, and of course that winds up clogging up the streets, and people in Santa Monica get very frustrated. They're clogged up streets and then fight against housing being put there. I mean, it just seems that the kind of work housing balance is just sort of out of sync in so much of the region, and whether there's mechanisms to manage that. And Sanai was saying that that one of the big problems is the lack of affordable housing, and yet I think one of you said that Long Beach has more housing than jobs. So if it has more housing than jobs, okay, I was just about to ask that. Is it luxury housing?
Yeah, literally buildings right here on Ocean Boulevard that claim to have a 97% occupancy rate, but security guards on site will admit that the property management companies that hire them tell them periodically throughout the day to turn on the lights. So it seems that.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem we have across the region, and.
This happens in Santa Monica. The only difference is Long Beach has 500,000 people. There's more people in Long Beach than Santa Monica.
That stand to be affected by it.
And because major freeways come through Long Beach, like the 710, you know, if you're driving to work at 3, 4 in the morning, the reason why there's such major traffic is because you have 500 to a couple thousand truckers clogging the freeway, and the reason they're clogging the freeway is because they have to drive from Riverside or Inland Empire area where they live because they can't afford to live.
Right.
Drive their trucks all the way over here.
This is the regional problem, which is exactly you are tying your point ties to the first question that was asked by the gentleman about creating this sort of dense urban environment that then doesn't function like a dense urban environment because people are getting in the car and driving 2 hours to get somewhere else. We interviewed a teacher in the Santa Monica School District, actually, the Santa Monica Malibu School District. She lives in Long Beach. She works in Malibu. She is getting up at 4 in the morning to drive from Long Beach to drive to Malibu, and then staying till something like 8 p.m. at night so that she can then drive back. So she sees her partner for like half an hour before she goes back to bed to get up early. So anyway, she seemed to personify this craziness.
But I just the other thing I was listening to when you were talking, I may have not interpreted right, but there was also this discussion of the right to the city. That's something we talked about tonight. Who has the right to the city? Whose voice is going to be in the city? And one of the things I think I was hearing you say was, you know, people coming from the suburbs, you know, with the suburban mentality or expectations, coming into the city and dictating potentially what should happen, and do they have a right to do that? What about the people that have lived there already in the city? Should the suburbanites dictate where transit goes and where access to the city
Right.
is. And I think that's an interesting question. I wish I could answer that. I think it's something we all are sort of struggling with.
But it's not.
We want development.
You won't.
We want
Sure.
development.
Yeah.
People who, ironically, a lot of suburbanites, much in the same way you're complaining about a lot of conservationists, try to utilize these things to undermine growth. Growth is coming, it's inevitable. Port is developing. The way global trade works, it's supposed to be a couple million. There's at least supposed to be 1 million people living here in the next 40 or 50 years. We keep getting references to places like Lakewood, places like Glendale, places like Burbank, Santa Barbara, Santa Monica. These are places that are beneath us, both in terms of population and economic growth to the national economy. So why are we still having development on one end related to these places, but also at the same end not accommodating what is already here, which is a city of workers?
I was just citing Don Waldy, who just happens to be a kind of interesting thinker. And those were the cities he picked, not necessarily my choices. I think there's an interesting conversation to be had about San Diego, actually, and how San Diego is densifying. But to your other point that you made about the suburbanites that come into the relatively urban situations and then sort of impose their values, I know a lot of regretful suburbanites, who actually hated that suburban upbringing and want to do the flip side. Conversely, there was a lot of people that moved out to LA from the urban environments of Chicago and New York, and they moved here to get away and live a nice suburban life. So where one grew up doesn't necessarily sort of inform your thinking, but it's definitely something to kind of always be aware of. But does it all end? Is one of the big issues parking requirements, and the fact that we still are building for this assumption that people are going to be driving?
Well, are we going to get into parking?
No, we'll finish at parking. I think we should wrap up
Yes.
there. Yes,
Yep.
yes. It's been a very lively discussion, and thank you for having us all the way from Santa Monica.
Well, thank you for coming. It's a great discussion. Thank you.
Great.